A simple waitress is scorned by arrogant customers until a millionaire reveals who she really is. The sound of laughter echoed through the restaurant's brightly lit dining room. Crystal glasses clinked in arrogant toasts as the young waitress, in her simple uniform and worn shoes, stumbled as she served a table of wealthy guests. Wine dripped down the white tablecloth like an open wound, and the entire room fell silent, only to hear the cruel laughter that followed. "She doesn't even know how to carry a tray, let alone have anything of value in life," said an elegant woman, crossing her legs as if swatting an invisible insect. Eyes turned to the waitress, and her face burned red. Cell phone cameras were raised, recording her embarrassment as a public spectacle. One of the young men filmed from nearby, muttering, "This is going to go viral." She took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears, but every step she took seemed to be followed by a chorus of contempt. It was as if the entire world had united simply to remind her of her place, small, invisible, and unworthy. But while the laughter was still echoing, a deep voice interrupted the spectacle. A man in an impeccable suit, who had been watching in silence until then, rose from the table at the back. His eyes were fixed on the waitress, but there was no pity in his gaze. There was respect. "Enough," he said firmly, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. He walked over to her and with an unexpected gesture picked up the wine-stained napkin. "Do you know who you're laughing at?" he asked, staring at the arrogant men. No one responded. He then raised his voice. "You're laughing at the heiress of one of the oldest families in this country. You're laughing at someone who lost everything, but didn't lose her dignity." People looked at each other in shock, unable to process the revelation. The waitress froze, unsure how this stranger knew her story. The room, once filled with laughter, was now an arena of wide eyes and held breath. The humiliation had changed hands. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. In the heart of New York, the restaurant gleamed like a stage, where luxury was the spectacle and glances were invisible blades that cut through those who dared to deviate. The young waitress walked among the candle-lit tables, balancing heavy trays with the delicacy of someone who couldn't fail. The sound of boisterous laughter came from a table in the center. Young men dressed in designer clothes, expensive watches shining like medals from a world where money was synonymous with human worth. They watched her like predators, scrutinized their prey, her every move an opportunity for mockery. The room exuded vanity and exhibitionism, as if the space were a showcase where everyone tried to prove their superiority. While the older waiters went unnoticed, she, with her simple uniform and weary gaze, became the preferred target, a weak point in the perfect setting. The millionaire, seated in the back, watched silently, his discreet presence contrasting with the opulence of the room. The atmosphere oscillated between the silent tension of those who felt observed and the euphoria of the arrogant, who saw this waitress as cruel amusement. There was something theatrical in the way the lights reflected on the silverware, and in the eyes that could not forgive poverty. And unnoticed, fate prepared its most silent blow, hidden behind indifferent looks and knife-sharp laughter. She grew up in a small rural town, where the houses were made of rickety wood, and the dirt streets turned to mud with every heavy rain. The smell of dust, mixed with that of stale coffee, was what lulled her mornings, but the food on her plate was often too little to satisfy her hunger. Her father had disappeared early, without leaving a letter or a promise, and her overwhelmed mother had fallen ill under the burden of raising 2 children alone. When her mother left too soon, she was left with only a younger brother who was eventually given up for adoption. From then on, loneliness became her constant companion. The girl's curious gaze turned into precocious resistance, forged by necessity. School was a place of more scars. Classmates laughed at her old clothes. shoes with holy soles and recycled notebooks with borrowed pages. She often feigned illness to avoid facing the daily humiliations. Every time she looked in the mirror, she promised herself that one day she would be more than they said. But the world seemed to laugh at that silent promise. As a teenager, she worked in the homes of wealthy families, cleaning marble floors and making beds she never slept in. She witnessed the painful contrast up close, children her own age surrounded by expensive toys, while she contented herself with folding clothes she could never wear. Once, a boss caught her looking at a designer handbag and said, laughing, "You could spend your whole life scrubbing floors and never have anything like that." These words seared themselves like a hot iron into her mind, becoming both a scar and a fuel. With each tear she swallowed in silence, an invisible force grew within her, a flame that the contempt of others could not extinguish. As an adult in New York, she survived on temporary jobs, sleeping in rented rooms shared with strangers. The past had given her no respite. She still carried the pain of abandonment, the hunger for recognition, and the longing for her lost brother who had become a ghost in her memories. Each tray carried in the restaurant wasn't just work. It was also the weight of years of accumulated injustice, years in which she was reminded of how cruel the world could be to those who had nothing. But what no one there knew was that behind the invisible waitress lay a history marked by losses so profound that they had built in her an unshakable dignity, ready to confront any humiliation. That night, the restaurant seemed noisier than ever, not just because of the buzz of conversation and the sound of silverware, but because something was brewing like a cruel prank about to begin. One of the extravagantly dressed young men at the center table raised his wine glass and gave his friends a provocative look, saying loudly, "I bet you $100 that this waitress can't cross the room with a full tray without spilling anything." The laughter was immediate, some clapping as if it were a show. She, who was carrying plates to another table, heard the cutting words and tried to ignore them, but the challenge had already been thrown. "Double the bet if she gets this far without trembling," said another, with a mocking smile, as if instigating a wicked game. Eyes turned to the young woman, transforming the simple act of serving into a spectacle of humiliation. She took a deep breath, knowing everyone was waiting for her downfall, that every step would be watched closely so that, at the slightest slip, the audience would burst into laughter. It was like walking an invisible tightrope with no safety net, only the weight of years of contempt pressing down on his shoulders. Deep down, the millionaire watched in silence, realizing that this wasn't just a foolish gamble by wealthy young people, but a cruel play on power, a reflection of a society that reveled in turning other people's pain into a spectacle. The moment arrived when the tray balanced in her hands trembled under the weight not only of the glasses, but of dozens of eyes ready to see. Her fail. The room fell silent like a theater before the first act, and each footstep echoed on the marble floor like a hammer against her chest. The table of arrogant young men was already bowing in anticipation of laughter, ready to record the scene on their cell phones, when a firm voice broke through the air. "Let me help you." The millionaire, until then discreetly in the background, stood and walked toward her. Those present looked at each other in shock, for it was unusual for someone like him, possessing an imposing posture, a tailored suit, and a silence that inspired respect, to intervene in scenes like this. He held the edge of the tray naturally, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. There was no pity, nor sarcasm. There was a silent recognition, as if he had seen her before in a place she herself couldn't remember. She tried to protest, but the words were lost in her throat. He smiled slightly, just to lighten the burden, and continued walking beside her to the table. The wealthy young men glanced at each other with contempt, as if his presence took away from the fun of the spectacle. One of them muttered, "Are you going to defend the maid now?" But the millionaire didn't react. Instead, he placed the tray on the table with the dexterity of someone who should never have been serving, but who carried an uncommon elegance in his gesture. Her eyes, still teary, followed every movement, trying to understand why this stranger enveloped her in his protective shadow. The contact lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough for her to realize he was no ordinary client. There was something strange in the way he recognized the weight of it, as if he were as exposed as she was. That had been their first crossing paths, discreet and unexpected, but charged with a tension that the entire room felt, even without knowing how to explain it. The laughter grew even louder, like a wave of mockery flooding the room. One of the young men raised his cell phone to record the scene and said loudly, "Look, you even need a nanny to carry glasses. That's what happens when you hire street vendors." The sentence was followed by laughter, and the humiliation was now not just directed at her, but at the very millionaire who had helped her. The waitress tried to maintain her composure, but each word cut like invisible blades. Another woman at the table, with impeccable makeup and a venomous smile, added, "Maybe she thinks one look from him will change her life." Poor, deluded woman. The entire room held its breath for a moment, as if the venom dripping from her words had permeated the air and branded the young woman in front of everyone. She lay motionless, her face burning, and her tear-filled eyes reflected the flame of shame that seemed impossible to extinguish. Every step she took toward the kitchen was accompanied by whispers and looks filled with contempt. The weight of the tray was no longer in her hands, but on her back, as if bearing the cruel confirmation that to this world she was nothing more than an object of laughter. As she turned to leave, she heard another cutting remark, spoken in a tone of bet. "One day she'll believe she's human." The laughter that followed was deafening. The scene had become a public spectacle, and she was center stage without having asked for applause. The millionaire, still silent, watched. His clenched fists under the table betrayed that this moment was more than a simple social scene. It wasn't just about a waitress being ridiculed. It was about collective cruelty, the thirst for humiliation to feel superior. And deep in her eyes, something lurked that no one there noticed, a silent flame of someone who had already known pain and had learned not to bow to it. But in that moment, in everyone's eyes, she was just the waitress who left defeated, as if contempt were the only role fate had reserved for her. She returned to the dining room with her face held high, as if the tears she'd held back had no more power over her. The table of arrogant people still laughed, waiting to see her flinch, but this time she didn't look away. She placed the plates firmly on the table, and before anyone could mock her again, spoke in a clear voice, but one filled with something no one expected to hear. "I know exactly what you're doing. I know about the bet, the whispers, the hidden cameras to turn my life into cheap entertainment. This isn't the first time you've tried to reduce me to nothing. The difference is that now I know this game better than you do." The room stopped. The sound of silverware clinked as if even the air had been suspended. The elegant woman, the same one who had called her deluded, laughed disdainfully, but her laughter died when the waitress continued. "I carry more history in my calloused hands than you could ever bear in the feet that parade these streets. Every scar of mine has a name. Every loss has taught me something. You think you're humiliating me, but I've experienced pain that not even your money could buy me to endure." The arrogant men looked at each other, uncomfortable with the unexpected firmness. This wasn't a plea, nor an uncontrolled revolt. It was the revelation of someone who had always silently known who he was and who didn't need their approval to prove it. The millionaire in the background raised his gaze slightly. For the first time, a barely perceptible smile appeared on his face, as if witnessing the beginning of something that would change the course of that night forever. That same night, as the room began to empty and the cruel laughter gave way to the heavy silence of the early morning, the millionaire asked to speak to the manager. As he waited, his eyes discreetly followed her to the kitchen, as if trying to fit the pieces of an ancient puzzle together. Her name, written on her cheap plastic name tag, seemed to echo in his mind. "Emma." He repeated it softly, and something stirred. A forgotten memory. Later, alone in his car, he typed that name into his cell phone. An old file surfaced amidst his research, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Traditional family loses everything after financial scandal. Photos showed an abandoned mansion, lawsuits, and, between the lines, the name of her father, a man who had once been a partner with her own father in million-dollar businesses. The shock was immediate. The waitress the arrogant men had turned into a target of humiliation was the daughter of one of New York's most respected and influential families, ruined by internal betrayals that never fully came to light. He vaguely remembered being a child and seeing her running through the garden of a neighboring house before everything fell apart. Now, years later, she was there, invisible, waiting tables and swallowing contempt as if she had never belonged. The secret was revealed. She was not just a waitress, but someone who carried a past of glory and fall, someone who survived in silence without ever exposing her true pain. For him, the revelation was not just a detail. It was the beginning of a silent debt to his own memory, as if he were obligated to restore the dignity that had been stolen from him. The next morning, when he returned to the restaurant determined to speak to her, he found only silence. He discreetly asked the manager, but the answer was curt. "She doesn't work here anymore. She quit last night." The millionaire felt a strange emptiness, as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. For the first time in years, a personal matter consumed him more than contracts and business deals. He returned in the following days, scouring old addresses, discreetly inquiring with acquaintances. But Emma seemed to have dissolved into anonymity, like smoke blown away by the wind. There were no traces, only the memory of the firmness in her eyes as she faced contempt, and the weight of the past that he now knew he carried with her. The remaining silence began to turn uncomfortable. At luxurious dinners he no longer saw the sparkle in crystal glasses, but the reflection of wine dripping onto the stained tablecloth. In encounters with arrogant partners, every laugh recalled the cruel sound of laughter directed at her. He realized that deep down, he missed not only her presence but the dignity she carried, even when everything was taken from her. It was as if Emma had ripped away an invisible mask he himself wore, forcing him to see that there was something beyond power and money. And this emptiness began to haunt him, a silent call that reminded him that she had disappeared not to escape, but to prove that she didn't need to be seen to be whole. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling everything, now discovered the anguish of losing that which cannot be bought, the presence of someone who restored meaning to silence. The punishment began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if fate itself had waited for the right moment to expose the millionaire. At one of the most important business dinners of the year, where he was to sign contracts that would further increase his fortune, a video surfaced on social media. It was the recording made at the restaurant, the laughter, the cruel remarks, the arrogant looks at the waitress. Although he wasn't the one who said the words, the scene showed him sitting, immersed in the same atmosphere, part of the silent spectacle. The internet was unforgiving. Headlines popped up. "Millionaire present at night," of humiliation against humble worker. What was once applause for his low-key stance turned into pointing fingers. Public opinion judged him not only for what he had done, but for what he had failed to do. Why didn't he defend her immediately? Why did he wait so long? Voices echoed in commentaries, interviews, and even in the cold hallways of his companies. Partners began to back away, investors pressured him, and invitations to gala events evaporated like smoke. The prestige he had built over years was crumbling before a society that now wanted to see him as the same target of scorn that the waitress had once been. He tried to justify himself silently, remembering the moment he'd helped her, but nothing seemed enough. The weight of every accusatory look followed him like a shadow, and her absence Emma hurt even more. It wasn't just his reputation that was falling, it was the entire ground that was falling beneath his feet, revealing the loneliness of a powerful man with no one to believe in his truth. His public downfall had become inevitable, and social judgment was relentless. The transformation began with silence, not words. For the first time, the millionaire began to avoid the dinners where he once shone. The gilded halls, the raised bowls, and the red carpets no longer held the same flavor. Where he once saw a showcase of status, he now saw only masks and empty laughter, painful reminders of the night he witnessed Emma's humiliation. In the hallways of his mansion, surrounded by works of art and silence, he realized he had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly filled the soul. He began visiting places he'd never set foot in. He entered shelters, spoke with forgotten people, and in every weary glance, he saw reflections of the waitress who once faced cruelty without bending. He began to refuse contracts that fueled injustice, questioning partners he'd previously feared confronting. The same man who made his fortune at the speed of numbers now stopped at small gestures, paying for meals for strangers, funding the education of young people without opportunities, listening to stories that would never make headlines. The press called him a hypocrite, trying to clean up his image, but he no longer cared. The social judgment that had once consumed him became a bridge to a greater truth. For the first time, he felt human. Memories of Emma haunted him, not as a ghost of shame, but as a silent beacon guiding him away from arrogance. He understood that true wealth lay not in signed contracts, but in the invisible impact he left on others. He ran into her by chance weeks later in an unlikely place, a small community library in the city's most forgotten neighborhood. There were no crystal chandeliers or tables covered in white tablecloths, just antique wooden bookshelves and children laughing among used books. There was Emma, sitting on the floor, telling stories to a group of little ones who looked at her as if she were the very author of the pages she was reading. The millionaire paused at the door, not daring to interrupt, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. That simple scene was worth more than any gala he had ever attended. When she noticed him, her eyes hardened for a moment as if the past still throbbed. He walked toward her slowly, unlike the confident man he'd always been, and said simply, "I looked for you." Emma calmly stood, put the book away, and replied, "There was no need. I'm not the spectacle you saw that night. I chose to disappear because I owe nothing to that world." The silence between them was heavy, full of things unsaid. He, however, didn't try to justify himself with grandiose speeches. He simply admitted with an honesty that surprised even himself. "Since you left, I've realized how empty my life was, and how much I'd never truly looked at anyone." She kept her eyes steady, but something in her face softened. Their reunion wasn't marked by hugs, nor by immediate reconciliation, but by a silent truth they both recognized. They were bound not by society's scorn, but by a dignity that had endured all. She took a deep breath before answering, as if each word needed to penetrate not only her throat, but also the years of scars. The millionaire looked at her expectantly, hoping for a gesture of reconciliation, but she maintained the firmness that had always accompanied her. "I didn't come back to be saved, nor to be remembered as someone who lost everything," she said calmly, without raising her voice. "I learned to survive without needing anyone's applause or pity, and that includes you." He tried to speak, but she gently raised her hand, interrupting him without aggression. "I don't harbor hatred. If I did, I'd be stuck in the same place where they tried to humiliate me. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back, it means moving forward. I've already found my life here, among these children, among people who don't need to prove anything to anyone to be valuable." The silence that followed was heavy, but there was no rancor in it. It was a silence of decision, of a path chosen with serenity. The millionaire lowered his eyes, understanding that, for the first time, the power was not in his hands, it was in hers. Emma didn't shout, didn't dramatize, didn't ask for anything. She simply offered the truth of someone who had learned to transform pain into freedom, and in that simple, devastating choice, she sealed their fate. He would be left with the emptiness of absence, and she with the dignity of not having to stay. Autumn was taking over the city. Golden leaves glided in the wind, covering the sidewalks like memories that time insisted on taking away. Emma walked down the narrow street that led to the community library, carrying a simple bag of books, her serene face illuminated by the sun filtering through the trees. In the distance, the millionaire watched her from a parked car, but he didn't approach. He simply followed her with his eyes, as if that image were the final anchor of something he could no longer reach. She entered through the wooden door, and children's laughter echoed from within. The sound carried across the street, alive, innocent, filling the space previously marked by silence and pain. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and drove off. The car slid through the dry leaves, disappearing around the corner. The imaginary camera remained in place, focusing only on the library's half-open door, from where a small childlike hand waved to Emma, earning a soft smile from her. No words were spoken, only the contrast between two worlds, one that faded into silence and another that flourished in simplicity. Her dignity remained untouched, and his emptiness irreversible. It was on a rainy afternoon that fate decided to cross their paths again. Alexander, already marked by the wear and tear of recent months, walked alone through the streets of New York, without the imposing imposition of his impeccable suit, just an ordinary man drenched by the water dripping from the awnings. He passed a small corner cafe, one of those he would never have noticed in his heyday, when something made him stop. Through the fogged glass, he made out a familiar face. Emily, sitting alone, with a notebook open before her. His heart raced, a feeling he couldn't name taking over his body. He pushed the door open slowly, and the metallic bell announced his entry. Emily looked up, surprised but not frightened. There was the same serenity in her gaze she'd always carried, only now mixed with a new firmness, as if time away had further solidified her essence. Alexander approached slowly, hesitantly, almost unsure, something unthinkable for a man who used to dominate entire rooms with his mere presence. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than he intended. She calmly closed her notebook and replied, "Mr. Carter." There was no rancor in his tone, but there was no intimacy either. It was simply a knowing, as if he were confronted by a stranger who had once crossed his path. He sat across from her without asking. For a few seconds they sat in silence, the sound of the rain outside filling the space. Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. "You disappeared, and I realized nothing made sense without you there. I needed to understand what happened." Emily held his gaze, steady, and replied with a calm that disarmed him. "I didn't disappear, Mr. Carter. I just stopped being where I wasn't respected." Those words pierced Alexander like a silent blade. There was no hatred, only truth. He tried to argue, to explain her mother's past, the silent debt she carried, but Emily raised her hand, interrupting. I always knew who you were, and I always knew how much my mother meant to your story. But I never wanted to be promoted out of pity, nor out of debt. I wanted to be recognized for my own worth." Alexander lowered his gaze, defeated. There was nothing he could say. All that remained was the vulnerability of a man who discovered, too late, that no amount of power could buy dignity or true affection. And in that small cafe, standing before the woman everyone called invisible, he realized that it was he who had been blind all along. The silence between them weighed more heavily than any words could. The rain beat against the cafe's glass like a relentless clock, marking every second Alexander waited for an answer he wasn't sure he deserved. Emily watched him, silently, and there was something in her gaze that was impossible to decipher. It wasn't anger nor pity, but a clarity that came only from someone who had suffered too much and learned not to give in. Alexander tried to speak, but his voice cracked in his throat. He shifted in his chair, his eyes brimming with tears in a way he hadn't even expected. "I know I was wrong," he confessed, with the sincerity of someone who no longer had anything to lose. "I spent my whole life believing that power equaled respect, that money was a shield against pain. But you showed me I was wrong. I didn't give you the promotion out of generosity. It was out of debt. And now I realize the greater debt wasn't to your mother. It was to you." Emily took a deep breath, looking away for a moment as if gathering strength to respond. The cafe around them continued its routine, people coming and going, scattered conversations, the smell of freshly baked bread. But in that small space between them, time seemed suspended. "It wasn't just you who made a mistake, Mr. Carter," she finally said, her voice calm. "I also made a mistake in expecting recognition from people who only saw what they wanted to see. I silently accepted humiliations I never should have tolerated. But I learned that dignity isn't begged for, it's sustained." He lowered his head, unable to look at her, but Emily didn't stop. "I could forgive you now. I could accept your apology, and maybe even return to the company. But what would that change? Respect can't be bought nor commanded. It's born from the silence of actions, from constancy, and I can't go back to a place where I have to prove every day that I deserve to exist." Those words were like a sentence. Alexander looked up, desperate for a second chance, but Emily just smiled serenely. It wasn't a smile of triumph. but of liberation. You gave me a title, but I found my worth on my own. And it's not behind a glass table that I'll keep searching for it. She stood. Slowly, grabbed her notebook and her worn bag, and stood before him for a moment that felt like an eternity. Alexander wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to hold her hand, but he couldn't move. There was something in her gaze that said clearly, the decision had been made. And in that moment, he understood that the greatest justice was not forgiveness, but the silent goodbye. Emily left the coffee shop without looking back, leaving him only her reflection in the rain-soaked window. The rain had stopped when Alexander left the coffee shop, but the world around him seemed different, as if the city itself had changed colors. He walked aimlessly through the drenched streets of New York, each step echoing the weight of the void left by Emily. The lights reflected in the puddles created distorted fragments, and for the first time he saw himself in that reflection not as the powerful man he had always been, but as someone reduced to the essentials, just a human being. Emily, meanwhile, walked alone toward a new life. She carried the same notebook, the same simple bag, but now there was something in her face that hadn't been there before. Freedom. She no longer needed to prove anything, nor seek approval in places that only knew how to offer contempt. Her silence was victory, her absence an answer. Days later, at the top of the skyscraper where Alexander spent his mornings overlooking the city, he opened his office window for the first time in years. A cold wind blew in, carrying loose papers that danced in the air. Among them, one of the old contracts fell onto the desk, Emily's mother's name highlighted in discreet letters. Alexander placed his hand on the paper and closed his eyes, as if finally understanding that the greatest legacy was not the numbers, but the invisible legacies of dignity. In the silence of the night, the lights of Manhattan shone as brightly as ever, but within him was a certainty. He would never get back what he had lost. Emily didn't need revenge, didn't need harsh words. Her justice was more powerful. It was the silent justice of someone who leaves, leaving behind only absence as an answer. And it was like that, without explanations, without speeches, just with the weight of a lost gaze on the city, that Alexander understood what he never wanted to accept. Some goodbyes are not defeats, but poetic sentences that echo forever in the hearts of those who remain. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.